Yes, so my presentation tonight is about the Vasse-Wonnerup Wetlands and the Waterbirds. It's a short introduction, if you like, to the various complex elements that make up the waterbird fauna of the wetland and the very interesting things that can happen at the Vasse-Wonnerup in relation to waterbirds. So the Vasse-Wonnerup Wetlands, a southwest icon of international importance. So the Vasse-Wonnerup Wetland System, what is it? Essentially, the system comprises two lagoonal wetlands, the Vasse and the Wonnerup. These occupy about 750 hectares. In seasonal times, in the winter, and when the water levels are high, the two wetlands are connected by a seasonal creek called Malbuck Creek. Part of the wetland system, the official conservation component of the wetland system, also includes portions of the Chewett Forest National Park. And this relates to the tree hollows and the availability of tree hollows for duck and other species breeding. And the combined system then exits at the Wonnerup Inlet. You've covered a lot of this type of country before in relation to the water and the water management through the previous presentations. So this is just a brief introduction as to what are the main components. The waterbirds of the Vasse-Wonnerup are a very complex and dynamic community. When we think about waterbirds, we often just think of ducks or swans or a few species, but actually the birds that make up the Vasse-Wonnerup wetland birds represent many different types of groups of birds coming from various locations. So if we have a quick look at this, we certainly have international migratory shorebirds. These are our summer visitors. These come from other parts of the world and migrate and feed in the summer period in the Vasse-Wonnerup. We have our Australian seasonal migrants, things I've called the grey nomads. These are species that essentially follow the sun, and so they're here over the summer and go to other places in Australia when our wintry conditions arrive. We have some episodic opportunists, things that just fly in occasionally, an eruption, feed briefly for a month or two and then move off, and we might not see them again for 3 or 4 or 5 years. We certainly have a series of residential species, those that are found permanently in the wetlands. And then we're talking about the wetlands, we're thinking about the wet lagoonal elements, but actually there's a series of bird species that survive and live around the periphery of the wetlands. These, if you like, you consider these to be the outer suburbs, so things that don't necessarily depend on the wetlands, but exploit the wetlands for a range of food and nesting and other items during the course of the year. And then, excitingly, we also occasionally get vagrant species. These are ones that are unexpected, they are often blown off course, they come from wherever in the world. You could call them the lost species. So when we talk about the waterbirds of the Vasse-Wonnerup, we're really talking about a whole mixed match of different types of species with different requirements from different points of origin. So what's the big deal about the waterbirds in the Vasse-Wonnerup? And are these wetlands in relation to waterbirds any different to others? To answer that, you type of need to understand the position and the place that these wetlands, the Vasse-Wonnerup, have in the bigger picture of the world. So one of the important things is birds are highly dynamic and highly mobile, and many of those species cover huge distances on an annual basis. Right around the world, patterns of bird movement have been identified, and these are called flyways. So the main flyway for us in Australia is called the East Asian Australasian flyway. And this is one of the great natural wonders of the world, the migration of thousands of individual species of birds from the breeding grounds in Alaska and Siberia, all the way through to their non-breeding and feeding grounds in Australia and New Zealand. This flyway, as depicted by the blue boundaries on this slide, cover nearly 23 countries, and nearly half of the world's human population occur in these countries. As a result of that, an expanding development, industries, and various other influences, the flyway is in danger of collapse. By collapse, that means that the places along the way that the birds would often stop for feeding and for rest and recuperation are being changed. They're being lost. The wetlands are being changed, they're being built on, they're being drying out, or various other things. Many of the birds that make these big journeys are not capable of flying the entire distance in one hit. There are some that can. The godwits, for instance, start off in Siberia and 4 to 5 days later, they're in Australia. They fly non-stop, not feeding at all, and they sleep on the wing as they fly. But most of the birds are much smaller than that, and they need to stop, refuel for a few days, and continue their journey. Vasse-Wonnerup is one of the key feeding sites for migratory birds in the southwest of Australia. As a result of these flyways and the movement of birds across many countries, there are a series of international conservation treaties that the federal government signs with other countries in order to protect the flyway, protect the feeding grounds, and protect the movement of these birds so they can continue their natural cycles. There are a number of these conservation treaties, including JAMBA, or the Japan-Australia Migratory Bird Agreement, CAMBA, the China-Australia Migratory Bird Agreement, ROCKAMBA, the Republic of Korea Australia Migratory Bird Agreement. These agreements list a series of species that occur in both of these countries and the provisions and the actions that each government agrees to undertake to protect them. Of the species that are listed, 31 of these have been known to occur at the Vasse-Wonnerup Wetlands. There's also a convention, an international convention on migratory species of wild animals called the Bond Convention. Locally, in Australia, we have federal government legislation, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act, which recognises the value of Ramsar wetlands, I'll come to that, and migratory species. And it gives these two classes of assets, biodiversity assets, the name Matters of National Environmental Significance. There's a series of laws and considerations that need to be undertaken when undertaking a development or some type of disturbance which might impact on these matters of national environmental significance. Probably the most important international convention or agreement is the Ramsar Convention. This is a convention on wetlands of international importance. It commenced in 1971 in Ramsar, which is the name of a small town in Iran. And it was the first international treaty aimed at conserving natural resources. The broad aims of the treaty are to halt the worldwide loss of wetlands and to conserve those that remain through the wise use and the management. There are 158 different countries that have signed on to the treaty, and Australia signed on in 1974, and in fact was the first country anywhere in the world to designate or nominate a particular wetland for inclusion on the treaty. This was the Coburg Peninsula in the Northern Territory. There are currently 65 designated Ramsar sites in Australia, 11 of them in mainland WA. The Vasse-Wonnerup was listed in 1990. The listing criteria for Vasse-Wonnerup include two key elements. Criterion number 5, which says that the wetland to be warranted or qualified as a Ramsar wetland needs to support at least 20,000 water birds at any one time during the year. And Ramsar Criterion 6, which says this wetland should support at least 1% of the population of the species. For the Vasse-Wonnerup, there are 4 species that meet this criteria. So the next question, we have these international criteria and the Ramsar criteria. Are the Vasse-Wonnerup wetlands meeting their Ramsar targets? And if not, why not? To answer that, we actually need to know how many birds we've got, when and where they arrive from, and what species we have. So that means there needs to be a monitoring program. So there is a monitoring program. It is a monthly monitoring program undertaken by officers and my colleagues from the Parks and Wildlife Service. The program consists of monitoring on a monthly basis at 10 different sites across the system. The monitoring includes counting all birds of all species at all sites in one day. So this requires generally 2 people with sunrise starts, and at peak times takes about 9 hours to count all the birds. There's a picture of one of my colleagues dressed in waders with her scope, standing in the water at the start of one of our count sessions. The results from these counts have identified that there's over 100 species recorded in total so far for the Vasse-Wonnerup. but on an average monthly count, we get around the 45 to 55. The peak numbers of water birds that have been recorded and any one time at the Vasse-Wonnerup is over 37,000 individuals. Let's move on. Let's have a look at how our results have been for the last 5 years of our monthly counts. So on this chart, we can see months down the bottom, the years across the top, the numbers of birds on the left, and the red line indicates the 20,000 mark, which is the Ramsar target for Vasse-Wonnerup. If we look at the chart, the green lines, we can see that in most years, at least on one of the months, the green line goes above the red line. That means we've achieved our target. We've seen at least 20,000 birds on the wetland at one time. But there are some years that it doesn't. And I draw your attention to year 2016 and 2018. In both those years, the numbers of birds did not exceed the Ramsar target. That raises questions as to why. You can also have a look at the patterns here and see that which month is the most popular month when we get the majority of birds. In general, you can see that December is the peak month, but sometimes that carries over to January. This again is influenced by a range of conditions and factors such as water level, such as temperatures, such as what else is happening elsewhere in Australia and potentially elsewhere in the world. Outside those peak times in December and January, the number of birds is generally fairly low, below the 5,000 mark. In fact, you can see if you look down the bottom of the graph that the wintry months, the June, July, August periods, are generally very low. The next criteria for the Ramsar and relates to the Vasse-Wonnerup is the 1% species. So these are species that represent 1% of the population. Our first member of this club is the Australian shoveler. And the 1% criteria for this species is 1% of the southwest of Australia population. So rather than the southwest of WA, the southwest of the entire continent of Australia. So we have generally receive shovelers here. The target for that is the red line, is 250. And you can see that most years we have some lines above the red. The other thing to note for this species is that generally the peak numbers are in June, July. So these are winter periods. These birds turn up in our wetlands in winter. They might persist through to the spring months and then disappear over the summer generally, and into autumn they're gone completely. Most years, again, we achieve our target, our 250 target, but some years we don't. A second species for our 1% criteria is the Australian shelduck. This is also a criteria of 1% of the southwest of Australia population. Unlike the shovelers, these guys turn up in late spring into summer. And we see we have exceeded our target line, our red line, by considerable numbers many times before. What we find here for these guys is that in the winter months, they're off breeding, and they often disperse to inland areas where there's water, in farm dams, in inland lakes, etc. But as the temperature rises in those inland areas and the water levels drop or evaporate, they move to the coast. So in October, we have a lot of Australian shelduck arriving, particularly with young animals. And so they spend the summer there, the young mature, get ready for flight, and then they disappear. Other times of the year, you can see the numbers of shelduck are relatively low. While there are some always present and every month, generally only a couple of hundred. A third member of the 1% club is the red-necked avocet. And this is 1% of the entire Australian population. So for this criteria, anything that's above the red line means that at least 1% of the entire population is occurring at the Vasse-Wonnerup system. Again, we can see here that these guys have pretty much a summer into autumn occurrence, generally in the summer periods. But when you get into the winter, into the spring months, they're disappeared. Often we get no birds. You can see also that in the orange line, 2019 year, we had significant numbers above our target. So instead of a target of around 1,100, we were getting nearly 2,500 animals. Can we explain this? It's an illogical explanation to why they've increased so much and then in subsequent years dropped down. To do this, you need to actually look about the whole of Australia and what the climate and weather patterns have been. And in 2019, much of the east coast of Australia was in drought. There was very little surface water for the wetlands on the east coast. So we suspect many of the birds for red-necked avocet moved from the east coast to the west coast. This is reflected in the numbers that we got. A final member of the 1% club is the blackwing or pied stilt. And this is 1% of the Australasian population. So this is the species that occurs also in Southeast Asia in parts of. And so 1% represents the entire population of Australia and those that occur in Southeast Asia. Similar to the red-necked avocet, these guys generally turn up in the warmer months, so November, December, January. The numbers can be quite large, and again, the orange bars representing 2019, you can see we're well above the red line. Again, probably representing the dry east coast of Australia and their movement to the west coast. There are persistent numbers of these species all through the year, but the numbers drop considerably low. There are various patterns here, and we can see that some years they persist. So if we look at the purple line, 2018, reasonably good numbers of blackwing stilt were here on the Vasse-Wonnerup wetland all through to May. And then they took off and they turned up again in November and into December. So these four species demonstrate highly variable patterns. And you can see that the populations vary and that the use of the wetland changes seasonally and yearly. So we've done a lot of bird counting. We've got some patterns and we've got some graphs, but do the numbers stack up? What are the trends over the longer periods of time? We're very fortunate for Vasse-Wonnerup is that we have some early data. Most of the wetlands in WA don't have a lot of data, but we have some detailed data of bird counts commencing in 1986 for a 3-year period, and then again in 1998, 99 through to the 2000s, and then our most recent stuff that we commenced in 2015. So if we look at this chart, and we compare the green lines, the orange lines, and the more recent blue lines, we can see that in the early counts, in the mid-80s, we were regularly exceeding the 20,000 birds that was expected for Vasse-Wonnerup. In fact, in January 1988 to 89, we had nearly 30,000 birds. Similar story for the late 90s into 2000, where we actually peaked around the 37,000. But again, that changed dramatically the next year. In our most recent counting, the last 5 years, although we have exceeded the 20,000 in most years, has not been to the same extent in those previous iterations of counting. Are there any explanations for this? Well, there could be many, but one of the fundamental things that's changed over that 34 years is the way that the water levels are maintained and manipulated over the summer months. So in the 80s period, there's no summer water level, so there's no inflow of sea level. The wetlands pretty much dried up every summer. In the mid-90s, late 90s to early 200s, there was a recognition there was probably a need to let some water in, particularly at the surge barrier areas in relation to fish deaths and other things. And so a small amount of seawater was let in and maintained in the Vasse in particular at minus 0.1 HC. And then in the more recent years, in the blue figures, we've done a series of trials of water levels and manipulations to try and control other aspects of the wetland. The fish kills, the algal blooms, the odor, etc. And one of the previous presentations covered a lot of that detail. The other thing we have for Vasse-Wonnerup on a longer trend is we have a series of counts and data that relate to the international treaty species. And these go back over 37 years. So I've selected 5 species as examples here to see how they're trending. So between that 80s period, the late 90s to 2000s, and the more recent times. So what we can see for the majority of them is the numbers have declined. So compare the current blue bar charts with the other colors, and you can generally see that the blue is much lower than the preceding decades. And that's across the board for all species. Is there explanations for this? Well, there could be many explanations for this. And one of the challenging factors for Vasse-Wonnerup in the management of the waterbirds is to figure out what influence different scales have on the ability of birds to present and make use of the wetlands. So when we're considering these questions, we need to think at the global scale, particularly for the international species. We then have the national scale, as I've talked about, changes in drought and rainfall conditions across the country. And then we have local influences. Some of the things that might influence the numbers and the types of birds, the species of birds turning up include climate change, the various annual rainfall patterns in the southwest and at a national scale, loss of habitat globally, nationally and locally. Has the habitat still there, but has it changed? Is it no longer suitable for certain species? The influence of invasive species, whether it be animals, plants, fish, they can all influence the birds. And have we changed the management of the wetlands? As I said, we've been manipulating water levels and other things in recent years. Maybe that's been good, maybe that hasn't been good for the waterbirds. That question's still unresolved. Despite all those, Vasse-Wonnerup is still a great place for waterbirds. Let's have a look at a comparison between Vasse-Wonnerup and our nearest next Ramsar site, which is the Peel-Harvey-Yalgarup Lakes, based in Mandurah. So the Peel-Harvey is a much larger wetland system, 25,000 hectares. And as a result, it can have a lot more birds. The peak numbers for Peel-Harvey have been up to 150,000. So this means the waterbird abundance is roughly 5.9 birds per hectare. Vasse-Wonnerup water body is much smaller, only 750 hectares. And we've had peak numbers of up to 37,000. But when you do the calculations, that means we average 49.3 birds per hectare. So we have a lot higher density and a lot more birds per hectare at the Vasse-Wonnerup than you do at Peel-Harvey. This is one of the things that makes Vasse-Wonnerup a really good site for waterbirds. The other thing is if you keep your eyes peeled, you can actually see and potentially find lots of interesting things in the waterbirds. One of the assets, one of the considerations for Vasse-Wonnerup, one of the other things that make it important is the black swans. So Vasse-Wonnerup has the largest regular breeding aggregation of black swans in the state. We regularly have over 200 pairs every year breeding here. And while some other places can have a greater number of swans on occasional years, such as inland lakes, these guys pretty much here all year, every year breeding around. The other issue is that there is always potential for individuals from various locations across Australia and across the world to turn up at Vasse-Wonnerup. The second image, below the swans on the right-hand side, is the little red-necked stint. This is one of the international species. If you look close, you can see an orange flag on one of the legs. So this is a bird that's been caught, captured, had its various measurements done, and a flag put on it. This particular individual was caught on the east coast in Melbourne, flagged at one of the popular wetlands there, and a few days later turned up at Vasse-Wonnerup. The bottom picture of that very striking duck is one of the vagrant species that has turned up. This is a northern pintail duck. Very unusual. Only a few individuals have ever turned up in Western Australia. And this particular individual turned up near the bird hide, which is the bigger picture in the slide, and stayed there for 3 or 4 days about 4 years ago. You never know what you're going to see. Just keep your eyes peeled. What I've got now is just a few short video excerpts. These are indications if you're out and about, the chances of what you might see in the Vasse-Wonnerup system, particularly over the summer months when we have our peak numbers of birds. This is the Wonnerup system. This is taken in late January in 2019. And you can see many hundreds, if not thousands of birds gathered in the shallow waters, ranging from the stilts and avocets to to various duck species, to cormorants on the fence posts. There's some swans in there. There's a number of the international migratory things as well. So highly dense, lots of birds, all within relatively close vicinity, make it a really good spot for bird watching. This little video shows red-necked avocets, one of our 1% species, and some banded stilts feeding in a little group. The interesting note here is they're prepared to duck their heads under the water. And even the common things can be interesting. Here's silver gull, but look at that unusual foot action. Splashing around in the shallows, stirring up the mud, bringing up little invertebrates and things for it to feed. So it's a bit of a news shot for you. Gulls can survive without fish and chips. All right, so that was just a really brief introduction to the types of water birds, some of the conservation issues associated with the water birds that are found in the Vasse-Wonnerup system, and a little enticement to get out, go and have a look for yourself. It's easy to do, and there's plenty of opportunities, particularly over the summer months. I'm happy to take any questions.